Today, I'm here to answer the important questions. Questions that plague my mind every day. Which of Tolkien's creations is more powerful? The legendary dragons, great worms that roam the Earth's airways and everything below, or the fiery Balrog, powerful, evil spirits with their great whips of flame? I started to really think about this when I was looking at the tallest characters in Lord of the Rings. In creating that list, I left out non-humanoid characters because even Spartan-sized people can't compete with trees and dragons. Tolkien gave us a wondrous world of these creatures, but we don't actually have too many examples of dragons and Balrogs interacting with one another. It must have happened at some point, and maybe it didn't look stupid. Could you imagine a scenario in which Smaug wasn't slain in Dale and showed up in Pelennor? Or a scenario where Durin's Bane wasn't slain in Moria and showed up later alongside the Mumakil? Which would be more effective though? Looking into the Silmarillion, we learned that the Balrogs were around since before Arda, Earth, was even formed, because these fire creatures are themselves Maya spirits, essentially lesser gods. For example, Sauron was a Maya spirit, and so were Gandalf and Saruman originally as well. The duel between Gandalf and the Balrog in Moria was really a fight between two ancient spirits, the clashing of two great flames. Fire is an important motif in the entire history of Middle-earth, going all the way back to Feanor, one of the most important elves of Middle-earth, with his name meaning Spirit of Fire. Fire is closely associated with creation, and Feanor was most renowned for creating the three jewels called the Silmarils, that really started the whole central conflict of the elves with Morgoth, and by extension Sauron. Getting back to the Balrogs, they were spirits with hearts of fire. This gives Gandalf's words towards the Balrog more meaning. I am a servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Anor. The dark fire will not avail you, flame of Udun. He's essentially telling this Balrog, this spirit of fire, that he himself is also a spirit of fire, and infamously, that he shall not pass. This gives you a sense of just how powerful Gandalf was, and how thoroughly over their heads the rest of the Fellowship was in Moria. What's interesting as well is that the Balrogs were not made by Morgoth, but rather they were spirits that were drawn to him. Morgoth would later go on to create his own creatures that were in all cases mockeries of things that others made. The orcs were mockeries of the elves. The dragons were mockeries of the eagles of Manwë, the Valar. As confirmed by Treebeard in Two Towers, the trolls were mockeries of the Ents. While it's not stated that the Uruk-hai Saruman made are mockeries of the Númenóreans, I think they are in a way. They were made by the breeding of goblin men with normal people. The Númenóreans came about as a result of the union of men and elves, and were much greater than ordinary men in wisdom, lifespan, and stature. So the Uruk-hai were in their own way a mockery of the union of men and elves, with the end result being a greater offspring. Uruk-hai, for example, are not only much stronger than ordinary orcs, but they are also not hindered by sunlight like normal orcs are. This theme and pattern of subcreation might seem random, but I believe it does have some bearing on the discussion of Balrogs versus dragons, as I'll explain later. So we know that the Balrogs were not created by Morgoth, and were instead recruited by him. Our first instance of them helping Morgoth in some way is when he calls for their help after destroying the two trees that lit the world, along with Ungoliant, Shelob's ancestor. Ungoliant devours a tree and grows more and more powerful, and would have eaten Morgoth himself if his Balrogs hadn't shown up and driven her off. This doesn't tell us too much because it wasn't one Balrog that drove off Ungoliant, but rather some unnamed amount. But it does give us an idea of how powerful they are. Ungoliant in that instance was capable of killing Morgoth, who is a Valar himself, and these Balrogs were enough to drive her off. So in numbers, they're in the realm of slaying Valar. They were able to very easily slay Feanor and Fingon, but in all these cases, Balrogs greatly outnumbered their foes. In the fall of Gondolin, Balrogs were at the sacking of Gondolin, and surprisingly, they were not that impressive. They died by the dozen against King Turgon and his elves. When Gondolin was destroyed, Morgoth let loose a great force upon it. There were Balrogs that rode upon great bronze fire serpents that moved across the field like dragons. King Turgon had 12 different guilds of knights, and one of those guilds was the Hammer of Wrath, which had an especially hard grudge against Morgoth, with its members being composed mainly of people who had escaped him before. They crashed against the Balrogs, overcoming the orcs that lay between them, and leaping upon the Balrogs themselves atop their great fire serpents. The men of the Hammer took the flame whips and wielded them against the Balrogs. In this onslaught was the first time any Balrogs had ever been slain by elf or man. This wouldn't be the last time in the same conflict either. Brog and his men were eventually all overcome and slain by the invading army because of how vastly they were outnumbered. But Brog and his men each slayed 7 foemen before they themselves were overtaken. Now it's unclear if this means that each man of the House of the Hammer slayed 7 Balrogs or just 7 orcs, and some Balrogs were slain too. I tend to think it's the latter, but one thing that's definitely clear is that the Balrogs died in great numbers in this battle at the hands of normal elves. Ecthelion, chief of King Turgon's soldiers, would go on to slay Gothmog, the lord of all Balrogs, in single combat, at the cost of his own life. And Glorfindel, who thousands of years later finds himself in Rivendell in Elrond's company and in those Battle for Middle-earth games, would do the same against another Balrog. King Turgon himself with his men would slay 20 of Balrogs. 40 Balrogs, which is insane when you think about it. There is a retch here though. This story isn't necessarily canon, or at least all of it isn't necessarily. The Silmarillion is a compilation of stories that Christopher Tolkien took from J.R.R. Tolkien's drafts and notes, mostly found in the Book of Lost Tales 1 and 2 and elsewhere. The stories there are mostly early versions with names and years changing. As far as anyone knows, the only complete version of the Fall of Gondolin is this version, which is found originally in the Book of Lost Tales 2, and re-released in the recent book Fall of Gondolin. It really depends on what you consider canon, and if there is such a thing when it comes to the Silmarillion. Christopher Tolkien himself admits that he has to sort of weave some story elements together to form a cohesive narrative because J.R.R. Tolkien wasn't able to sort everything out. Like how Galadriel met Celeborn, for example. There's like 3 different versions of that. With regards to upwards of 40 Balrogs being slain, this is from the only complete version of the story of the Fall of Gondolin. The version of the Silmarillion is much shorter and only references the 2 that Glorfindel and Ecthelion slew. As to whether that means definitively whether only 2 Balrogs were slain or possibly 40 something, I'll let you be the judge. Personally, I think that many Balrogs being slain by ordinary elves greatly diminishes their status, but I don't know if we'll ever have a definitive answer to that. What do we know about dragons in Middle-earth? Despite being the series that inspired Dungeons and Dragons, there are only 4 named ones: Glaurung, the father of dragons, Ancalagon the Black, Smaug the Golden, and Scatha the Worm. Glaurung's story is wrapped up in the story of Turin Turambar, which I really don't want to spoil, but suffice to say he's a flightless dragon with great powers of speech, and he was able to destroy an elf kingdom almost all on his own. Pretty formidable. He was slain in single combat, but by a man with a great destiny and a legendary sword. And then there's Ancalagon the Black, a very powerful flying dragon who was released to fight when all of the armies of the Valar descended upon Morgoth and his fortress. The invading Valar were victorious, but even they were wary of Ancalagon and his fire. It was speculated by Gandalf that even Ancalagon's fire would not have been hot enough to melt the One Ring, though it was likely hot enough to melt lesser rings of power. And then we have Smaug the Golden, who Bilbo meets in this adventure. He's another dragon that possesses the ability to fly and breathe fire like Ancalagon. He terrorized the people of Dale and lived as a legend for well over a century in that area. If we compare the damage that dragons and Balrogs do, we have one example of a Balrog wiping out a dwarvish kingdom in Moria, and several examples of dragons doing that same thing. Smaug, for instance, was able to haunt the people of Dale. Glaurung destroyed Nargothrond. The Cold Drakes, basically dragons that can't fly or breathe fire, giant lizards, terrorized the dwarves of the Grey Mountains to the point that they all left and moved to the Iron Hills. That being said, those Cold Drakes were in great numbers, and the dwarves didn't migrate out of fear of one particular dragon. And speaking of dwarves, the dwarves feared Moria because of the Balrog that lived there, Durin's Bane, and they feared the dragon that lived in the kingdom under the mountain, Smaug. However, with the help of Gandalf, it wasn't considered suicide by the wise to attempt to reclaim the Lonely Mountain from Smaug. Thorin's grandfather, Thror, was certifiably insane when he wandered back to Moria to reclaim his throne. Even the name, Durin's Bane, implies a great reverence and fear the dwarves held towards that Balrog. Durin was one of the fathers of all the dwarves, and he was dubbed Durin the Deathless, because the ruling families would always name their heirs Durin. So for this Balrog to be called Durin's Bane implies a much deeper-seated, almost racialized fear all the dwarves collectively held towards this Balrog. In contrast the Balrogs with Scatha the Worm, a dragon killed by one of the Rohirrim, the Horse People. The dragons were a numerous race of creatures in the northern realms of Middle-earth comparatively. Picture this: you're some person living in Middle-earth. Obviously you don't want to live near dragons or Balrogs, but the dwarves in the Grey Mountains fled because of all the Cold Drakes, and they didn't call the Cold Drakes Durin's Bane. And you might be thinking, well yeah, those were the weakest of all dragon kind, flightless and no fire breath. But Smaug, a fire-breathing flying dragon, while legendary amongst the dwarves, didn't necessitate some similar title as the Balrog of Moria did. But at the same time, the Balrogs were able to drive off Ungoliant, a spider capable of killing Morgoth, and Ancalagon was able to hold all the armies of the Valar, presumably with the Valar themselves, off for a time. So there are definitely extremes in either case. I think the average dragon is probably much weaker than the average Balrog, with the greatest dragons being in times long past. However, the greatest of the dragons are probably more powerful than the Balrogs. Gothmog, the lord of Balrogs, was slain by no doubt a mighty warrior, but just one elf, Ecthelion. Glaurung, similarly, was killed by a man who was destined to slay Morgoth at the end of time. And Calagon's fire was hot enough to burn lesser rings of power, and he was able to hold off the armies of the Valar. Not to downplay Ecthelion, Agon, King Turgon's other right-hand man, Glorfindel, was said to be one of the only people able to face the 9 ring wraiths. So if Ecthelion is of comparable power to Glorfindel, which he likely is, they were both King Turgon's generals and both died killing a Balrog, then he was definitely no slouch himself. It's important to remember what I said earlier, that Morgoth did not create the Balrogs, and he did create the dragons. And all of Morgoth's creatures are a mockery of something. What are the dragons a mockery of? The eagles. But they're still a sub-creation of Morgoth, whereas the Balrogs were spirits all their own. They weren't made in mockery of anything. So who would be stronger? A creature wreathed in flames, or a great serpent that can breathe flames? We have this from the Book of Lost Tales too. Now those drakes and worms are the evilest of creatures that Melko has made, and the most uncouth. Yet of all are they the most powerful, save it be the Balrogs only. Seems pretty definitive, if not for the possibly 40 or so Balrogs killed in the fall of Gondolin alone. Though I think the assertion that on average Balrogs are more powerful, with the exceptions of a few dragons like Glaurung and Ancalagon being more powerful, is reasonable. The dragons are the evilest and most powerful that Morgoth has made, and the most powerful of all, save Balrogs only. It's an interesting sentence because Morgoth did not create the Balrogs. The dragons are the most evil things Morgoth has created, and separately, they are the most powerful, besides Balrogs. Another interesting thing to note is the stature of the Balrogs. From the fall of Gondolin we know that the Balrogs are twice the stature of the elves, and elves and people generally in those days were in the 7 to 8 foot range. So Balrogs are 14 to 16 feet tall, and Balrogs were riding bronze fire serpents into Gondolin. Is it possible those serpents were fire drakes? I think it's fairly likely. Speaking of the tallest characters in Middle-earth, we now know that dragons at least outrank Balrogs as far as their height is concerned. Dragons were Morgoth's creations and his answer to Manwë's giant eagles. Consider that Thorondor, the chief of Manwë's eagles, had a wingspan of 30 fathoms, which is about 180 feet, over half a football field. So contrary to Peter Jackson's portrayal, these things were absolute monsters. If dragons were of comparable size, then they would have to be much larger than Balrogs, which, as I mentioned, they were ridden into battle by Balrogs in the fall of Gondolin. Separately, it's not even generally agreed upon that Balrogs have wings or can fly. It's a long-running debate in the Tolkien fandom. However, 2 instances of Balrogs being killed involves them being thrown into chasms, with Gandalf in Moria and Glorfindel in Gondolin. Food for thought. It's possible that Balrogs derive their power from their innate spirit, much like many elves and powerful Maya like Gandalf and Sauron do. The power of the Balrogs is in their physical forms to an extent. However, they are smaller than dragons, and likely also lack the ability of flight, yet Tolkien considered them more powerful than dragons. Balrogs are likely more powerful than dragons in the same sense that Sauron is more powerful than dragons. Sauron wouldn't destroy a countryside with his mere presence, despite what some people would have you believe, yet a dragon could. And even though the dragon poses the more immediate threat, it was the threat of Sauron that received 3 books, and the threat of the dragon Smaug 1 lighthearted book. In fact, Sauron and Balrog share a similar station, as both are mightier spirits and lieutenants of Morgoth. In the first stage, Sauron was known as Gorthair the Cruel. He was a powerful servant of Morgoth, but he was just a lieutenant. Similarly, Gothmog, the Lord of Balrogs, was also a lieutenant of Morgoth. Who's to say that if Gothmog hadn't been slain in Gondolin that he wouldn't have ended up as Sauron's second-in-command in Mordor instead of the Witch King? This difference in station may be in part why the Balrog in Moria was known as Durin's Bane, and why Smaug never received a similar title. Or if some twist in fate resulted in Gorthair the Cruel being slain and Gothmog surviving into Middle-earth. Maybe Gothmog would be the Dark Lord in Mordor instead of Sauron. Balrogs derive their power in part from their status as beings who existed before Arda was formed, where dragons, while powerful, do not. That's it for now. Thanks for watching if you made it this far. Give the video a thumbs up if you liked it, and subscribe if you want to support the channel.